Sarah Chen adjusted her Nikon D850 camera strap for the 100th time as their rented Ford Explorer lurched over another pothole. The late September sun filtered through the dense canopy of the Olympic National Forest, creating a strobe-like effect that made her stomach do lazy somersaults. In the driver's seat, Mike Thompson, their hired guide for this photography expedition, cursed under his breath as the SUV's GPS flickered and died again. "Piece of shit technology," Mike muttered, tapping the screen with a calloused finger. At 45, he had the weathered look of someone who spent more time with trees than people, his beard peppered with gray and skin tanned like old leather. This is why I told y'all we should have stuck with paper maps." In the middle row, Carlos Martinez squeezed his wife Elena's hand. They were both ecology professors from UC Berkeley, and this trip was supposed to be their working vacation, studying the impact of climate change on old-growth forests. Elena offered a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How much farther to the trailhead, Mike?" "Should be another 20 minutes, Mike replied, though Sarah noticed the uncertainty in his voice. They'd left Port Angeles 3 hours ago, and something about the forest felt wrong. The usual cacophony of birdsong was absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against the vehicle's windows like a living thing. In the back row, 16-year-old Josh Parker had his nose buried in his phone, despite the complete lack of signal bars. His 14-year-old sister Amy stared out the window, her pale face reflected in the glass. Their parents had sent them on this trip hoping it would build character after a particularly rough year at school. So far, all it had built was resentment. "Did you guys hear about what happened here in '78? Josh suddenly piped up, reading from what appeared to be a cached web page. "Whole family disappeared. They found their campsite totally trashed, but no bodies. The rangers said it was a bear attack, but..." "That's enough, Josh." Mike cut him off sharply. "We don't need to be sharing ghost stories." Sarah caught the guide's eye in the rearview mirror. There was something there, a flicker of fear? Knowledge? Before she could analyze it further, the Explorer's engine made a sickening, grinding noise and the vehicle shuddered to a stop. "Perfect," Mike sighed, pulling over to the shoulder of the narrow forest road. "Everyone stay put while I check it out." As Mike popped the hood, Sarah took the opportunity to snap a few photos through the windshield. The forest pressed in around them, ancient conifers stretching toward a sky that had begun to fill with heavy clouds. Through her viewfinder, she noticed something odd about the trees closest to the road. Deep gouges in the bark, too high up to be from any normal wildlife. The sound of Mike slamming the hood made everyone jump. "Battery's dead," he announced, climbing back into the driver's seat. "And wouldn't you know it, no cell service to call for help." "So what do we do?" Elena asked, her accent thickening with anxiety. Mike pulled out a folded map from his jacket pocket. "There's an old Forest Service cabin about 2 miles from here. We can hike there, spend the night if we need to, and I can come back for the car tomorrow." "Hike?" Josh groaned. "With all our gear?" "Just grab what you need for overnight," Mike instructed. "We'll lock the rest in the car." As they began sorting through their belongings, Sarah noticed Amy standing very still, staring into the woods. "Everything okay?" she asked the teenager. "Something's watching us," Amy whispered, so quietly Sarah almost missed it. A gust of wind swept through the trees then, carrying with it the faintest hint of decay. Sarah shouldered her camera bag, trying to shake off the sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Above them, the clouds continued to gather, promising rain. They set off single file down the narrow trail, Mike in the lead and Sarah bringing up the rear. The silence of the forest seemed to swallow their footsteps, and more than once she caught herself looking over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that something was following them, something that didn't want to be seen. Not yet. The first drops of rain began to fall as Mike led them around a sharp bend in the trail. Sarah's camera, safely tucked in its weatherproof bag, bounced against her hip with each step. The forest had grown denser, if that was possible. The ancient trees pressing so close together, their branches created a natural canopy that turned the afternoon into premature dusk. "How much further?" Carlos called from the middle of their single file line, his voice tight with concern. Elena hadn't spoken since they'd left the car, her usual vibrant demeanor replaced by something that looked unsettlingly like fear. "Should be just ahead," Mike replied, though Sarah noticed he'd checked his compass 3 times in the last 10 minutes. "There's a clearing where—" He stopped abruptly, causing Josh to bump into him. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, moving up beside him. Then she saw it. The clearing was there, all right, but what dominated it wasn't the promised Forest Service cabin. Instead, a massive Douglas fir lay across the space, its enormous root system torn from the earth, as if some giant hand had yanked it up in anger. The tree's fall had created a wall of dirt and debris nearly 15 feet high. "That's not normal," Elena whispered, her first words in over an hour. As an ecology professor, she would know. "Look at the root pattern. Trees don't just uproot themselves like this." Mike's weathered face had gone pale. "This wasn't here 2 weeks ago. I did a survey of this area for the Forest Service and—" He cut himself off, shaking his head. "The cabin's just on the other side. We'll have to go around." As they picked their way around the fallen giant, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach clench. The tree's bark was marked with those same deep gouges she'd seen earlier, but here they were fresher, the wood still oozing sap. And there was something else. A smell that didn't belong in the clean forest air, something musky and wild that reminded her of the big cat exhibits at the zoo. "Hey, look at this!" Josh called out. He'd moved ahead of the group and was pointing at something near the base of the root wall. Sarah raised her camera instinctively, then lowered it as she processed what she was seeing. Embedded in the tangle of roots and earth was a shoe. Not just any shoe, a hiking boot, relatively new by the looks of it. And it wasn't empty. The cabin was smaller than Mike had promised. A single room with a rustic stone fireplace, 2 sets of bunk beds, and a small kitchenette that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. Sarah's camera clicked rapidly, documenting the space while the others brought in their gear. The light filtering through the grimy windows had taken on the sickly yellow cast that often preceded a major storm. "Found the generator," Carlos called from outside. A moment later, ancient fluorescent tubes flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the cabin's interior. Elena was already examining the bunk beds, her scientist's eye cataloging years of wear and graffiti carved into the wooden frames. "At least it's dry," Mike said, though his usual confidence seemed forced. He was examining a locked metal cabinet near the fireplace, fishing through his keyring. "Should be some emergency supplies in here. Might even have a radio we can use to call for help." The cabinet's hinges protested as Mike swung it open. Inside, Sarah could see stacks of canned goods, some first aid supplies, and, most promising, an old emergency radio. But what caught her eye was a leather-bound book wedged behind the supplies, its spine cracked and faded. "What's that?" she asked, reaching past Mike to retrieve it. The leather was soft with age, and when she opened it, the musty smell of old paper filled her nostrils. "Looks like a diary," Josh said, peering over her shoulder. "Cool. Maybe it's got some ghost stories in it." "It's a field journal," Mike corrected, his voice oddly tight. "Forest Service personnel are supposed to log their observations when they stay here." He reached for the book, but Sarah had already begun reading the first entry, dated September 15, 1978. "First night at Outpost 23. Replaced Jenkins, who rotated out early. Nervous breakdown, they say. Can't blame him after what happened to the Wilsons. 3 months and still no bodies. Ranger Stevens thinks it was a bear, but I've been tracking bears for 20 years and I've never seen sign like this. The marks on the trees are wrong. Too high, too deliberate. And the smell, Christ, that smell. Like death and musk and something else I can't place. Whatever did this is still out there. I can feel it watching." Thomas Burke, Forest Service. Sarah looked up from the journal to find Mike staring at her, his face ashen. "We should put that away," he said quietly. Some things are better left. A crash from outside cut him off. Amy screamed, and Elena dropped the can of soup she'd been examining. Carlos was at the window in 2 strides, peering into the gathering darkness. "Something knocked over the generator," he reported. The fluorescent lights flickered once, twice, and died, plunging them into the gray twilight that seeped through the windows. Sarah turned back to the journal, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned to the next entry. The handwriting was messier here. Urgent, September 16, 1978. They found another campsite today, same as the Wilsons, tents shredded, gear scattered. But this time there was blood, so much blood, and footprints, if you can call them that, 18 inches long at least, deeper than any print I've ever seen. Stevens is calling in the state police, but they won't be here until tomorrow. The locals know something. The old-timers at the general store clam up when you mention the disappearances, but I overheard Mrs. Redcrow, the woman who runs the diner, talking about the tall one and something about a cycle. Every 30 years, she said. Like clockwork. I'm not supposed to be writing this. There's a gag order on all Forest Service personnel regarding the incidents. But someone needs to know. Someone needs to understand what's happening here. The journal continued, Burke's entries growing more frantic, more detailed. Sarah read about his discoveries, ancient petroglyphs hidden in caves showing massive humanoid figures, reports of missing hikers dating back to the 1800s, and most disturbing, evidence that whatever was stalking the forest was intelligent, methodical, and patient. The generator's death rattle echoed through the cabin like the last gasp of a dying animal. Sarah's fingers tightened around Burke's journal as the darkness pressed in through the grimy windows. Outside, the rain had intensified from a gentle patter to a thunderous drumbeat on the cabin's metal roof. "Everyone stay calm," Mike commanded, his voice steady despite the tension evident in his posture. He pulled a heavy-duty flashlight from his pack, its beam cutting through the gloom. "Carlos, help me check the generator. Elena, there should be some emergency lanterns in that cabinet." Sarah watched as Elena moved toward the metal cabinet, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. The professor's usual confident demeanor had cracked, revealing something raw and frightened underneath. The journal's weight in Sarah's hands seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. "I don't like this," Amy whispered, pressing herself into a corner of the lower bunk. "Something's wrong. Can't you feel it?" Josh, for once, didn't mock his sister's fear. He sat on the edge of the bunk beside her, his phone forgotten in his pocket. "Maybe we should try to walk back to the car," he suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. The cabin door creaked open, letting in a gust of wet wind and Mike's frustrated curse. "Generator's completely dead," he announced. "Looks like something tore through the fuel line." He exchanged a look with Carlos that Sarah couldn't quite interpret. Elena had managed to find 2 battery-powered lanterns, their pale blue LED light creating more shadows than illumination. She set them on the small table in the center of the room, where they cast strange patterns on the ceiling. "We need firewood," Mike said, moving to examine the fireplace. "There's some stacked outside under the overhang. Elena, would you mind?" "I'll go," Carlos interrupted quickly, already reaching for his rain jacket. "You stay here, mi amor." The tenderness in his voice made Sarah's chest ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "No," Elena said firmly, straightening her spine. "I'm not some helpless city girl. Besides, we'll get more if we both go." She pulled on her own jacket, its bright yellow material almost luminous in the lantern light. Mike looked like he wanted to object, but something in Elena's expression stopped him. "5 minutes," he said instead. "Any longer and we come looking." The Martinezes stepped out into the rain, the door closing behind them with a finality that made Sarah. She turned back to Burke's journal, flipping past the entries she'd already read. The next page was dated September 17, 1978, the handwriting increasingly erratic. "It's hunting us now." Jenkins wasn't crazy. He knew. The scratching at night, the way it mimics human voices. God help me, last night it sounded just like my wife calling for help. But Mary's been dead for 3 years. Stevens radioed in this morning. The state police aren't coming. Something about jurisdiction issues. But I know better. They've dealt with this before. They know what happens when people start asking too many questions. The marks are getting closer to the cabin. Every morning. New ones, higher up the trees. It's showing us it can reach places we can't. Teaching us our place in the food chain. A sudden crash from outside made them all jump. Mike was at the door in 2 strides, yanking it open. "Elena? Carlos?" The rain swallowed his words. Sarah joined him at the doorway, raising her camera instinctively. Through the viewfinder, she could see the woodpile had been scattered, logs thrown in every direction, as if something had plowed through them in a fury. "Elena!" Carlos's voice carried from somewhere in the darkness, tight with panic. "Elena, where are you?" The rain hammered against the cabin's metal roof like 1,000 tiny fists as Carlos's voice echoed through the darkness. Sarah's camera flash illuminated snapshots of chaos, scattered firewood, muddy footprints that seemed to lead in every direction, and something else that made her blood run cold. Deep in the wet earth, a single massive footprint filled with rainwater, easily twice the size of any human foot. "We have to find her," Carlos said, his voice cracking. He was already moving toward the tree line, his flashlight beam cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Elena, Mike grabbed his arm. "Wait, we need a plan. Going out there blind is suicide." The guide's face was a mask of controlled fear, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows between the trees. "Sarah, show me those photos you just took." Sarah's hands trembled as she brought up the images on her camera's display. The flash had captured details their eyes had missed. Broken branches high above the woodpile, strips of yellow fabric that matched Elena's rain jacket caught on thorns, and most disturbing, a smear of something dark and wet on one of the logs that didn't look like rain. "That's blood," Josh whispered, peering over Sarah's shoulder. Amy had pressed herself against the cabin wall, her eyes wide and unfocused. "It's watching," she murmured. "It's always watching." Mike pulled out his map and spread it on the cabin's small table, weighing down the corners with lanterns. "Listen carefully. The old-growth forest creates natural corridors, game trails that anything large would have to use. If something took Elena, it would follow these paths." His finger traced several lines on the map. "Something?" Carlos spat. "You mean someone, a person did this. It has to be a person." But his voice held a note of desperate denial. Sarah thought of Burke's journal entries, of the massive footprint outside, of the claw marks 20 feet up the trees. Whatever had taken Elena wasn't human, not even close. "We'll split into 2 teams, Mike announced, though Sarah could tell he hated the idea. "Carlos and I will take the northern trail. Sarah, you and Josh check the southern route. Amy stays here, locks the door behind us. No one, and I mean no one, goes off alone." "I'm not staying behind," Amy protested weakly, but her face was pale as milk. "Yes, you are," Josh said, surprising everyone with his forceful tone. "Someone needs to stay here in case Elena makes it back on her own." He squeezed his sister's shoulder, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the man he might become beneath the teenage bravado. They gathered their gear quickly, flashlights, emergency whistles, the few weapons they had. Mike's hunting knife, Carlos's Swiss Army knife, Sarah's heavy camera tripod. Sarah noticed Mike slipping something else into his pocket, a small revolver she hadn't known he was carrying. 3 whistle blasts for emergency, Mike instructed. 2 for a find, 1 to signal your location. Stay within sight of your partner at all times. If you see, he hesitated. If you see anything unusual, don't engage. Just signal and wait for backup. The discovery of Elena had changed everything. Sarah's hands shook as she tried to clean the mud and blood from her camera lens, her mind replaying the scene they'd found in the hollow of an ancient cedar. Elena, conscious but changed, her eyes holding a wildness that hadn't been there before, muttering in a mixture of Spanish and something older, something that made their teeth ache when they heard it. Carlos hadn't left his wife's side since they'd brought her back to the cabin. She lay on the lower bunk now, wrapped in emergency blankets, her skin burning with fever despite the cold. The scratches on her arms and legs were unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, not the parallel lines of a bear or mountain lion, but single, deliberate marks that seemed to form patterns. "It's trying to tell us something," Amy whispered, staring at Elena's wounds. The teenager hadn't moved from her corner since they'd returned, but her eyes tracked every movement in the cabin with an unsettling intensity. "It's writing on us." Mike was at the table, Burke's journal open beside the map, his face illuminated by one of the LED lanterns. "The patterns match," he said, his voice hoarse. "Look at this." He held up the journal, showing a page where Burke had sketched similar marks. He found these on other victims, called them the old words. Sarah raised her camera, documenting the similarities. Through her viewfinder, she noticed something else. The marks were changing, the skin around them darkening like an infection spreading through Elena's veins. "We need to get her to a hospital," Carlos said for the 100th time. His academic's composure had crumbled, replaced by raw fear and desperation. "Please, we have to try," Mike shook his head. "The rains washed out the access road. Even if we could get past..." He glanced at the windows, where shapes seemed to move in the darkness beyond. We'd never make it to the highway." The night stretched endlessly, each hour marked by Elena's fevered mumblings and the persistent scratching sounds from outside the cabin. Sarah's camera sat on the table, its memory card full of images she wasn't sure she wanted to review. The marks on Elena's skin had spread, creating intricate patterns that seemed to pulse in the lantern light. "Their coordinates," Josh announced suddenly, breaking the tense silence. He'd been studying the marks for hours, comparing them to Mike's topographical map. "Look, these lines match the elevation patterns, and these symbols, they're like trail markers, but older." Mike moved to examine Josh's discovery, his weathered face tight with concentration. "The kid might be right," he admitted. "But coordinates to what?" A sharp crack from outside made them all jump. Sarah raised her camera instinctively, its viewfinder offering a false sense of security, as if viewing the horror through a lens might somehow make it less real. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of movement, something massive shifting between the trees, too fluid to be a bear, too large to be human. "It's getting bolder," Carlos whispered, still holding Elena's burning hand. His wife had stopped speaking an hour ago, her eyes now fixed on something only she could see. "Why doesn't it just..." He couldn't finish the thought. Amy, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly stood up. "It's teaching us," she said, her voice carrying an odd resonance that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Like it taught the others. Like it's been teaching for thousands of years." "Amy, honey, sit down," Sarah started, but the teenager continued as if she hadn't heard. "The marks aren't just coordinates," Amy said, moving toward Elena's bunk. "They're a language, the oldest language, and once it marks you..." She reached out toward Elena's arm, her fingers trembling. "Don't touch her," Carlos snapped, but it was too late. The moment Amy's fingers made contact with Elena's skin, both females went rigid. Elena's eyes snapped open, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same strange resonance as Amy's. "The chosen will join the dance." The first rays of dawn brought no comfort to the cabin's occupants. Sarah's camera had finally died, its battery drained from hours of documenting Elena's transformation. The marks on the professor's skin had spread across her entire body now, creating an intricate tapestry of ancient symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. "The coordinates," Josh insisted, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. He'd been working through the night, transferring the patterns from Elena's skin onto Mike's map. "They're not random, look. They form a spiral pattern, centered on..." He stopped, his finger hovering over a point deep in the wilderness. "The devil's backbone," Mike finished, his face ashen. "It's an old mining claim from the 1800s. The locals won't go near it. Say it's cursed." Carlos hadn't moved from Elena's side, but his head snapped up at Mike's words. "You knew about this place? All this time?" The tension in the room thickened. Sarah noticed Mike's hand drift toward the pocket where he kept his revolver. Before he could respond, a sound from outside froze them all in place. the distinct crack of a branch breaking, followed by something that might have been laughter, if laughter could contain centuries of malice.
"It's calling us,"
Amy whispered. The teenager had been sitting cross-legged in the corner, her eyes unfocused. "All of us, but especially..." She turned to look at Elena, who had begun to tremble violently. "The chosen will join the dance," Elena muttered, the words carrying that same otherworldly resonance they'd heard before. "The old ones rise. The forest remembers." Sarah raised her dead camera out of habit, then lowered it with a curse. "Mike," she said carefully, "what aren't you telling us about the devil's backbone?" The guide's weathered face seemed to age another decade as he sighed. "It wasn't just a mine," he admitted. "The original settlers found something there, cave systems older than the forest itself. And the petroglyphs," he shuddered. "The Forest Service classified everything in '78, after what happened to Burke and the others. The discovery of the tunnel entrance changed everything." Sarah stared at the narrow opening they'd found behind a false panel in the cabin's fireplace, her photographer's eye noting how the stone had been carefully arranged to look natural while concealing something far older. The beam of her backup flashlight revealed rough-hewn steps descending into darkness. "This is why they built the cabin here," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying a weight of knowledge that made Sarah's skin crawl. "To monitor the entrance. To keep watch." Carlos hadn't left Elena's side, but his eyes were fixed on the opening with a desperate intensity. "The marks," he said, gesturing to his wife's symbol-covered skin. "They're getting warmer, like they're responding to something down there." Amy stood at the edge of the opening, swaying slightly. The teenager's connection to whatever force had taken hold of Elena seemed to grow stronger by the hour. "The old ones are waiting," she whispered. "They've been waiting so long." Sarah's camera bag felt heavy against her hip, useless without power but impossible to abandon. She'd loaded her spare battery, saving it for whatever they might find below. Something told her she'd need to document what lay ahead, whether she wanted to or not. "We should split up," Mike suggested, but Sarah cut him off sharply. "No, no more splitting up." She met his eyes, seeing something shift behind them. "You know more than you're telling us, Mike, about this place, about what happened in '78, about everything." The guide's weathered face seemed to age another decade as he sighed. "My father was Burke's partner," he admitted, "the one who found his body after what happened in the tunnels. Dad never recovered from what he saw, spent the rest of his life trying to warn people away from this place." "And you became a guide here anyway?" Josh asked incredulously. The teenager had been uncharacteristically quiet since their discovery of the tunnel entrance. "Someone had to keep watch," Mike replied softly. "Someone had to know the signs, try to prevent." He gestured helplessly at Elena's marked body. A sound echoed up from the tunnel depths, something between a growl and a laugh that made them all freeze. Elena's eyes snapped open, and when she spoke, her voice carried that same otherworldly resonance. "The chosen must descend. The dance begins anew." The transformation began at midnight. Sarah watched through her camera's viewfinder as Amy's skin started to ripple, the same ancient symbols that covered Elena now emerging on the teenager's flesh like frost patterns on a window. The spare battery was dying, but she kept recording, knowing that someone needed to document what was happening, even if they didn't survive to share it. "It hurts," Amy whimpered, her voice alternating between her normal teenage timbre and something older, something that made the cabin's timbers creak in sympathy. "It hurts, but it's beautiful. I can see them now, all of them, through all the years." Carlos hadn't moved from Elena's side, but his scientific detachment had crumbled entirely. His wife's body was barely recognizable now, the symbols having spread to cover every inch of visible skin, pulsing with a faint bioluminescence that cast sickly shadows on the cabin walls. "The marks," Mike said, his voice hoarse. "They're a map of something bigger, something older than the forest itself." He spread out his father's old papers on the table, pointing to similar patterns documented decades ago. The natives called it the Great Dance, a cycle of transformation that's been happening here for thousands of years. Sarah's camera battery finally died with a soft beep, but she kept it raised like a shield. "You knew," she accused Mike. "You knew what this place was when you brought us here." The guide's weathered face seemed to collapse in on itself. I thought I could stop it this time. Break the cycle. That's why I chose this group. A photographer to document, scientists to understand, young minds still open to the old ways. He gestured helplessly at Amy and Elena. But it chose them anyway. It always chooses. A sound from outside made them all freeze. Branches snapping, but not from the wind. Something massive was moving through the forest, circling the cabin with deliberate, almost ceremonial steps. The rhythm of its movement matched the pulsing of the symbols on Amy and Elena's skin. "Josh!" Amy suddenly gasped, her eyes rolling back to show only whites. "Josh is coming back! But he's not. He's not alone anymore." The cabin's walls seemed to breathe in the pre-dawn darkness, expanding and contracting with each pulse of the symbols that now covered both Elena and Amy's skin. Sarah's dead camera hung uselessly at her side, but she couldn't stop framing shots in her mind, documenting the horror even as it consumed them. "They're coming," Amy whispered, her voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that made the timbers creak. "All of them. The old ones, the dancers, the chosen." Her eyes, now completely white, rolled in their sockets. "Josh is leading them home." Mike stood at the window, his father's revolver gripped tightly in one hand, Burke's journal in the other. "It's happening faster this time," he muttered, flipping through the weathered pages. "The cycle's accelerating. Dad's notes mentioned this possibility, something about environmental changes affecting the ancient patterns." Carlos hadn't moved from Elena's side, but his scientific demeanor had crumbled entirely. His wife's body was barely recognizable now, the glowing symbols having spread to cover every inch of visible skin. They pulsed in complex sequences, like some terrible binary code being transmitted to unknown recipients. "Look at the pattern," Sarah said suddenly, moving closer to Elena, despite Carlos's warning growl. "The symbols, they're not just spreading randomly. They're forming concentric circles, like..." She stopped, her throat tight with realization. "Like a target," Mike finished grimly. "Or a beacon." A sound from outside made them all freeze, branches snapping, but not from the wind. Something massive was moving through the forest, circling the cabin with deliberate, almost ceremonial steps. The rhythm of its movement matched the pulsing of the symbols on Amy and Elena's skin. "Josh!" Amy suddenly gasped, her eyes rolling back to show only whites. "Josh is coming back! But he's not alone anymore." The cabin's walls seemed to breathe in the pre-dawn darkness, expanding and contracting with each pulse of the symbols that now covered both Elena and Amy's skin. Sarah's dead camera hung uselessly at her side, but she couldn't stop framing shots in her mind, documenting the horror even as it consumed them. "They're coming," Amy whispered, her voice carrying that otherworldly resonance that made the timbers creak. "All of them. The old ones. The dancers, the chosen." Her eyes, now completely white, rolled in their sockets. "Josh is leading them home." Mike stood at the window, his father's revolver gripped tightly in one hand, Burke's journal in the other. "It's happening faster this time," he muttered, flipping through the weathered pages. "The cycle's accelerating. Dad's notes mention this possibility. Something about environmental changes affecting the ancient patterns." Carlos hadn't moved from Elena's side, but his scientific demeanor had crumbled entirely. His wife's body was barely recognizable now, the glowing symbols having spread to cover every inch of visible skin. They pulsed in complex sequences like some terrible binary code being transmitted to unknown recipients. "Look at the pattern," Sarah said suddenly, moving closer to Elena despite Carlos's warning growl. "The symbols, they're not just spreading randomly. They're forming concentric circles." She stopped, her throat tight with realization. "Like a target," Mike finished grimly. "Or a beacon," A sound from outside made them all freeze, branches snapping in a rhythmic pattern that matched the pulsing symbols. Through the grimy window, Sarah caught glimpses of movement, massive shapes flowing between the trees with impossible grace, their forms seeming to shift and change in the darkness. "Josh!" Amy called out, her voice carrying that same terrible resonance. "Josh is ready. We're all ready. The dance begins." The first rays of sunrise painted the cabin's windows in shades of blood. Sarah's fingers traced the edge of her dead camera, wishing she could document these final moments. Not for posterity, she'd abandoned hope of survival hours ago, but to prove to herself that what she was witnessing was real. Elena and Amy had begun to move in perfect synchronization, their symbol-covered bodies pulsing with an inner light that made Sarah's eyes water. The patterns had spread beyond their skin now, creeping across the cabin's wooden floors and walls like luminescent vines, forming intricate mandalas that seemed to breathe with ancient purpose. "It's time," Amy whispered, her voice carrying that terrible resonance that made the timbers groan. "The dance is reaching its crescendo. Josh is bringing them home." Mike stood at the window, his father's revolver hanging limply at his side. The weapon seemed absurdly inadequate now, like bringing a match to fight an inferno. "I'm sorry," he said, his weathered face streaked with tears. "I thought I could stop it, break the cycle, but it's been waiting so long, gathering strength." Carlos hadn't moved from Elena's side, but his scientific detachment had transformed into something else, a terrible understanding that showed in his eyes. "The symbols," he said hoarsely. "They're not just a language or coordinates, they're a key, opening something that should have stayed locked." A sound from outside made them all freeze, footsteps approaching the cabin, but not the thunderous impacts they'd grown accustomed to. These were lighter, almost playful. "Human, Josh," Sarah breathed, raising her useless camera out of habit. The cabin door swung open without a touch, and Josh Parker stepped into the pre-dawn light. But it wasn't the sullen teenager who'd disappeared hours ago. His skin rippled with the same ancient symbols that covered Elena and Amy, but his were different. Older somehow, more complex. His eyes, when they met Sarah's, held millennia of patient hunger.